Attention everybody, the views and opinions expressed on this show are not necessarily those of Axe Ministry, Axe Media Group and or their affiliate and subordinate ministries and or nonprofits. So today, on Crime Time, special guest, Dr. Mary Beth Wilkas. But here's your host, Dr. Steve Albrecht. Take it away.
Thanks, Matt, and welcome to Crime Time. This is Crime Time podcast episode 46. I'm Dr. Steve Albrecht, and I'm joining you from the Axe Media Group studios in Springfield, Missouri. So for this hour, I have a guest. I'll be talking this hour about the extraordinary life of my friend and threat assessment colleague, Dr. Mary Beth Wilkas Janke. She has a new book out she just wrote, which you can get on Amazon. It's in paperback and hardback and also on Kindle. The book is called The Protector, a woman's journey from the Secret Service to guarding VIPs and working in some of the world's most dangerous places. And I'm telling you, the book is a page-turner. It's written almost like a spy novel, and we'll talk about how she got where she was. She's had a fascinating career. She's currently an adjunct professor of psychology at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. So thanks for listening to Crime Time, where we talk about crime and crooks and cops and personal security. We'll talk about some dangerous people and lots of heroes, and we'll even mention a few stupid crooks. Most importantly, I'll talk about what you can do to keep yourself and your family safe from crime and violence. As always, you need to be vigilant at home and in your neighborhood and in your community and at school and at work and even on the road. This show exists to make you feel more empowered, more secure, and more educated on security issues and the criminal justice system. As background, I worked for the San Diego Police Department for 15 years as a patrol officer, reserve sergeant, and a domestic violence investigator. I now work as a training consultant and teach training workshops focusing on human resources, employee coaching, workplace violence, and security issues in the workplace. I've written 23 books on business and workplace violence and police subjects, and also on guns, all of which you can find on Amazon. My 3 gun books are available on Amazon Kindle. You can always reach me at my website, which is crimetimeradio.com. Send me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn, and you can also follow me on Twitter at Dr. Steve Albrecht. That's ALBRECHT. You can find past episodes of the show on SoundCloud.com, and you can get new ones on YouTube every Tuesday when the show runs live. So Dr. Mary Beth Wilkas is my guest, and she's joining me from Washington, D.C. Mary Beth, how are you?
I'm doing great, Steve. How you doing?
Well, I read your book, and the first thing I was thinking of, you should have changed the subtitle to being superhuman. That would have been my subtitle, that you were superhuman. So I'm not going to give you a superhero status because that's, for the Marvel Comics folks. But superhuman, that would certainly apply to you because you've done a lot of things and been a lot of places. And when you read your book, I'm telling you, it's a page turner. People will have to get it and go, how did this woman get through this extraordinary life in one piece, going to all these places, dangerous situations, oftentimes with a gun in your hip. So congratulations on the book. I really appreciate the effort that you put into it because you go deep into your conversations, your history, how you got from where you came out of college and traveled overseas and went to Spain and through the Secret Service and all your events in a way where the level of detail is just incredible. So I guess my first question to you is, did you keep a journal or some kind of diary, or how did you remember everything that happened?
Yeah. So it's a combination of things. When I first started writing, I pulled out all those, back when we actually used to print photos, and pulled out boxes of photos from my missions. Some journals, Steve, not a ton, and even when I opened them, I'm like, God, I was a really crappy journaler, and it really didn't say much, but at least it gave me some context. And then also, depending on the location, I kind of reached out to colleagues that I worked with. Like, I was a Secret Service agent 1,000 years ago, it feels like. And so when I was writing up the raid scene, I tossed that whole chapter to a female friend of mine that I went through training with. I'm like, Jeannie, is this legit? Like, is this how it happened? And so even wording sometimes, I'm like, what did we call the boss? Did we call him this? Did we call him that? The terminology had escaped me. So I would say it's been sort of a combination of racking my brain, talking to people, looking at photos, and looking at journals.
So when you're writing the book, I'm guessing that it felt cathartic. You had to have said, I need to get some stuff off my chest. I need to feel differently about it and write differently about it than I did maybe 20 years ago when these things happened, 25 years ago. So it must have felt empowering in one sense to write the book and to have the end goal as being the finished product, but it also must have been pretty cathartic, yes?
Yeah, clearly coming from you, who's written 23 books, and I had no expectations. I really didn't know that would have been one of the bonuses. It was very cathartic, and I really didn't expect that. And, each chapter was just going through, who I worked with, where I was, the people I was protecting, the challenges, the annoyances, the awesomeness. And it was as much frustrating as it was fun. And I think unbeknownst to me, I mean, like I said, you would know that because you've done 23 of them, but for me, it was like, wow, I didn't really realize maybe I was carrying some of that stuff that I did need to just sort of process and get rid of.
I guess the problem with me is, I had kind of the typical difficult childhood, divorced parents and all that kind of stuff. And so a lot of that stuff for me and my I guess maybe from college, on down to my, being 5, 6 years old, my parents got divorced. I packed all that stuff away. So it would have been difficult for me to write a memoir. I'm trying to, there's been a long book process I'm trying to work on, which is a collection of stories about my grandfather, who was a beloved guy, beloved Baltimore guy. And it's tough to think about those things in the detail that you need to make it an interesting story. So I really commend you on the level of detail you were able to bring to the book in terms of, I guess a parallel would be two of my favorite writers are John Krakauer, who wrote the book Into Thin Air, which is the story of the Everest tragedy, and then also Sebastian Junger, who wrote Perfect Storm, which is about the guys that died on the fishing boat, and that type of writing where you take the person there. I mean, I'm standing in the room with you while you're doing a Secret Service detail, or I'm standing in the room with you when you're in Spain. That's how it feels, like kind of an over-the-shoulder sort of an observation of what you're doing. I just don't have that talent. I don't have that skill to dredge up stuff that happened in terms of the conversations. I remember sort of bits and pieces of things, and so I really, that's a writing skill I just don't have. And so you can tell in your book when you read it that you have that. You look at other people's books that are sort of memoir-based, and they have kind of a surface feel to them, but you really dug deep.
Well, let's add to this then. I will be honest that I think some of the magic in the writing came from my editors, Sal and Lindsay. They obviously had the bones that I wrote. I mean, Steve, when I sat down to write this book, I intended to write my whole story, and that would have meant also including all the different investigations I did. However, once I finished writing about my protection missions, I had 600 plus pages. Well,
wow.
My editors not only pared that down, but really sort of wove the story at a level that, I'll say that I wasn't willing to. What do I mean by that? There are people, and in this whole process, maybe you've discovered this as well, that go through all these, these seminars, these retreats on how to write a book and the flow and the arcs and the character development. And I'm like, oh, no way. Like, I got to pay somebody to do that because I do not have that skill set and I just don't have the time. So, yeah, I mean, they even came and they interviewed me and recorded all the interviews and just, rewove some of what I wrote. Like, yes, a lot of the memory and some of the creative writing was mine, but I'm really going to give them a tremendous amount of credit.
So from my perspective as a writer, when you say the word 600 pages in terms of the total manuscript, my first thought is there's your second book. So
yeah, I think if I write a second book, so unlike you, I would suspect you consider yourself an author. I didn't, and I don't consider myself an author. I really just wanted to tell my story. It was a commitment I made at a certain point for certain reasons, and I think I might write my investigator book, but my fears, and this is just a discussion both with myself and my husband, is how much danger am I putting myself in? Because in my investigations, unlike my protection, well, in some of my protection assignments, people didn't know I was a protection agent, but for most of the time they knew. In my investigations, with the exception of one investigation outside of the Secret Service, people never knew I was investigating them. So I did things like get on a plane to talk to somebody on a flight from D.C. to Germany. I lived in a home in a certain part of this country to quote-unquote befriend somebody to feed intel to somebody who had fears because of this person. I, got a membership to an American Airlines flight lounge because there was a particular employee for a particular company that thought this individual was an alcoholic and wanted me to watch him to see if he was drinking through a business meeting in this lounge.
So, there's an as told to perspective where you have to kind of step back and sanitize the material. I know you know that. And, I just go back to how much material you have. I learned a defeat from my dad, as a writer. And, I kind of believe a perspective of writing, which is like French cooking, waste nothing. Everything goes into the pot. You take the bones and the tops of the carrots and the celery stalks. It all goes into the stew pot. And so, I know you know how to craft the material. I would say even the stuff that didn't survive the first book is got to get put into the second book because, I think you're such a gifted storyteller that you say, this shouldn't sit, on my hard drive for the rest of my days.
Here's my hope, Steve, and maybe one of your listeners will jive with this and can make it happen. I'm hoping it turns into a Netflix series, and then all that material will then be part of the flesh out.
Wow, that'd be cool. I mean, is there? Do you have somebody that can kind of make those conversations happen from literary agent perspective, or anybody that's in PR or production or anything like that?
Working on it. It's a process. And I've gotten great feedback, but that's not enough to make a book or a movie happen. I think timing is interesting. I'm a strong female in a man's world, and post-Me Too movement, my stories aren't Me Too, but my stories support the Me Too movement in the sense of, because you read the book, about my Secret Service departure was not on my own volition. And I was encouraged from every side and every person, including the Female Agents Organization, to pursue a sexual harassment, a sexual discrimination suit, and I absolutely refused. And because to me, that's not what happened, and there was just no way I was going to lie just to be able to get my job back. So
Yep.
I think that's important in this time. So who knows about timing, about who gets their hands on the book and wants to do something about it.
Well, the good news is you're in a good city for that type of story. I mean, you're close to New York, but being in D.C., there's tons of people that have interest in the entertainment community. I want to get into the start, the beginning, middle, and end for your life story because it's fascinating. But just one more question.
Sure.
I'm guessing your husband probably had his eyebrows raised on several parts of the book that maybe he just didn't know stuff about your life that you unveiled in the book. I mean, did his mouth hang open at certain times to go, I didn't know you did that?
Definitely, because I don't talk about myself very much because, as you can imagine, I mean, my life, one of the considerations for the title was in the shadows. I mean, when you're a protection agent, you are doing your job, you're shutting up, you are in the shadows, you're not obvious. And so one of those things entails, shutting the F up, minding your own business, keeping whatever information you find out about your protectees or about their lives, about their families to yourself. And so sometimes when people ask me, it kind of catches me off guard. It's like, and having my story out there, it's a little bit freaky. But Mike was like, wow, like you never told me this. Mike is my husband. Or you never told me this, or you never said this. I didn't know you did this. And I'm like, yeah, sorry, just the way it goes. I mean, similar to him, Mike's a former Navy SEAL, so there's a ton of missions that, probably most of which I don't know about.
And correct me if I'm wrong, he also works as a professor as well, does he not?
No, my husband?
Yeah, I thought he taught with
No,
you.
Mike,
you guys teach together? Or?
No, Mike has taught, as a guest lecturer in my classes. Mike, right now, next week I start teaching the psychology of crime and violence, and he's one of my 6 guest lecturers. He talks about the psychology of terrorism.
Okay.
But Mike actually Mike's an entrepreneur, so he currently, with one of his business partners, they invest in cutting-edge technology companies.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have a website, marybethwilkas.com, WILKAS, marybethwilkas.com, and there's a lot. I got that right, correct? Yes. There's a lot of really cool kind of timeline stuff there. So if you look at your website and you go through, what you call the beginning, and then Spain, and then the Secret Service, and then post-Secret Service, and then your investigative life, and your training as a forensic psychologist, and your teaching, and then your Columbia work. There's a lot of kind of a path there that people can see on your website. So start us from the beginning and just say, you're an Indiana girl, you're athletic, and you're kind of a tough cookie, and you start thinking about what you want to do, and you have an aptitude for languages, so Spanish, which I'm guessing there's not a ton of Spanish speakers in Indiana to practice with.
I'm actually from Chicago, a suburb of called Park Ridge, but I went to Indiana University in Bloomington for my college career, which
Right.
I, to this day, am thrilled I chose it because, living on the East Coast, I've lived everywhere, you know that. And when I go back to the Midwest, I'm like, God, and especially when I go back to IU, I'm like, God darn it, these people are just so flippin' nice naturally. Midwest values, Midwest morals.
That's why I'm in Springfield, Missouri.
Yeah, I know, you know.
And
it's a different, I'm not a huge, no offense to any listeners, I don't jive necessarily with the East Coast. Their focus is a little different. Same with West Coast. I think, every part of the world probably jives with where they were born and raised,
So you're a criminal justice, major, and your Spanish major. That was really a kind of a movement towards something in a law enforcement career at that time, yes?
Yeah, so I knew when I went to Indiana University, I was going there for criminal justice. It was a class I took my junior year of high school that was an elective, and I was the only junior. And it was sort of this confluence of law enforcement, sort of all these different facets. And at one point, I remember coming home and telling my parents, oh, my God, I totally know what I'm going to do. I'm going to be, and I told them I was going to be an FBI agent.
Right.
And from that, my father, perhaps coincidentally, worked at a company in downtown Chicago, and one of his fellow executive VPs of the company was a former FBI agent. And so that was amazing for me in that I would go down. My father worked in a building called the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. And I would go down, I would take the train down, meet my dad for lunch. He would walk me through the office and tell everybody, this is my daughter that wants to be a Charlie's Angel, ha ha, everybody ha ha. And he would walk me to Marlon Johnson's office, who was the former, when he retired, he was what's called the SAC, the special agent in charge of the Chicago office of the FBI.
That's a pretty big
And
job.
I would,
There's a
was
fair amount of
amazing.
crime in Chicago. I don't know if anybody knows that, but back then there was a fair amount of crime. Now there's a fair amount of crime in Chicago.
Yeah, just different. That was more mob related back then, I think. And Marlon Johnson would. It was, to me, he was this, bigger than life man, and he just treated me so kindly and made it seem so like something that was I could get to. It was attainable. It was doable. And so I would ask him a ton of questions. And if there was a question that I had that he couldn't answer, he would plop the button on his phone onto speaker, and he'd dial the Chicago field office of the FBI, and he'd say, oh, I have this amazing woman in front of me, and she's going to be a great agent someday, and she has a question that I can't answer. And he would get all my questions answered, and it just was like, wow, and I would go down at least, once, twice a year. And he was just a great mentor. And, I owe part of it to him. And then later in life, when I went to college and studied criminal justice, when I got into my core courses, one of my professors, he wasn't a federal agent, but he was high-level law enforcement in Indiana, and one of his former students, who was a female, had become a Secret Service agent. So he connected the two of us, and then we talked, and then she made it even seem more attainable, right? So little by little, and that's one thing I would say to people who are interested in I don't care if it's like your brother's cousin's uncle, and it was 30 years ago that he was an agent in some agency, even military. You want to find out what interests you and maybe more importantly, what doesn't interest you. There's a lot of agencies out there, and we are all so different, but people don't know that.
And
so
the thing about,
it's important to understand what each agency does.
Yeah, and the thing about law enforcement career, many people think it's sort of, patrol cop and patrol deputy, sheriff's department, police department, maybe state police.
Yeah.
But then you look at all the state investigative agencies that exist in this country, and you look at all the federal, even gun carrying, special agents in the insurance, field that work for the Department of Insurance for a state or something like that. Or, we have agriculture cops that investigate stuff. So, you think about the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. There's got to be 2-3 dozen agencies that train their special agents there, in the basic law enforcement academy, and then they put them in a special program that comes out depending on what their specialty is. And so, really, after 9/11 and the movement of everybody kind of under the Department of Homeland Security umbrella, there's just so many places that you can get a job if you have the background for it and you have the patience, really. And that's part of your story as well, is how long it takes to go through these processes. And You know, I remember when I was with the PD, I mean, I think it took, 8 months or something to get through the whole background process, the polygraph and the medical and all that stuff. So it's a journey, and I think the reason the journey is difficult is they're trying to weed out the folks. Your husband would know this, the difficult part of SEAL team training is the beginning, where they're trying to weed out the people that are not going to hack it.
Absolutely.
So you really have to have a lot of patience. And so, you apply with the FBI, and it's sort of ironic when you read the book, applying for the FBI sort of participated in your departure from the Secret Service.
Yes. Yeah, that was, not a happy day for me. But, people, when as people have been reading my book, I'll get phone calls or emails like, oh, I'm so pissed off about, what happened with you to the Secret Service. And I'll write back and I'll say, I totally understand that and I appreciate you being on my side. But in my personal opinion, they did me a favor. Like, in the moment, I thought it was hell. It was my dream job. It's what I went to college for. It's what I thought I was going to be. But when they made the ultimate decision, to let me go, which I'll let your readers read that in my book as to what happened, I feel to this day like there's just no way anybody can convince me otherwise that they did me a huge favor. My life post-Secret Service was far more dangerous, far more interesting, far more adventurous, and it really made me be a much more resilient and resourceful individual because as a Secret Service agent, as most people can imagine, when you're protecting the number one in the world, the President of the United States, you have all the resources you want. I went from having that to my very first job out of the Secret Service in Lima, Peru, protecting what was considered a high-level VIP with only one other person. And a little bit of peripheral assistance, but not like, it was not only eye-opening, it was like, suck it up, Wilkas, you're going to have to learn how to do this because you no longer have a badge, you no longer have that title, and you're going to need to learn. And every job brought on new challenges because maybe I was in a different country, or I would go from a high-level protectee, say, when I was almost 8 months in Haiti protecting the then president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, to a family in Sarasota, Florida, that were billionaires, and they had an unfortunate incident happen, which they then decided that it necessitated that their family have security. So, like that adaptive nature of you go from, say, the garbage-ridden streets of Haiti to this life in Sarasota, Florida on private jets and really nice hotels. It's just this, everything was so different, but everything also necessitated, such an ability to adapt to a race, to a culture, to the protectee, to your teammates. Every team I worked with, you've read in the book, some of them really sucked, and some of them were awesome.
Just like in law enforcement, we have great cops and people that should not be cops.
Amen.
So, one of the things I got from your book, from just your post-college life, going to Spain for 3 years, and the idea that, it takes a fair amount of courage for a young woman, fresh out of college or in your 20s, and you say, I'm going to get on a plane and leave the United States and go to a foreign country by myself. And I think about, people sort of stay stuck in their rut where they don't ever leave the United States and they don't ever see any other parts of the world, and sometimes they don't even leave their own state. So
Sure.
A lot of courage for you to do these things where you say, I've got to get a passport and get overseas and take care of myself. And also I have to protect other people and protect myself, oftentimes alone.
Yeah.
So, there is a sense of courage that you had to have there, yes?
Yeah, I think, and thank you for that. I think in those moments I didn't think about it. And, when I made that decision, I had studied my junior year, second semester in Seville, Spain. And when I graduated, everybody, at least my friends, were interviewing for these sales jobs. And I was like, oh, my God, this is kind of bullshit. Like, that's not me. Like, yeah, I have the personality, but that's not what I want to do. That's dumb. So I said to my parents, I was like, listen, I'm going to go spend the summer in Spain because I just want to be more bilingual. And so I got on a plane. I did spend a month in Scandinavia as sort of a happy graduation gift to myself, and I was with a couple of friends. And I ended up in Spain, and that summer that I said I was going to spend, I ended up spending 3 additional years. So, and then I got bored, and I was like, okay, the challenge is done. I've done, teaching English. I lived in a phenomenal part of the city. And I think that's telling in that people said to me, I said, I want to live in the barrio Santa Cruz, which is the old Jewish quarter. Very charming, flower patios, very narrow streets, etc., cute bars, and
a lot of tapas.
Oh, no way. Yeah, great tapas bars, fabulous tapas bars. And with all those windy streets, they're always super hard to find. And people would say, oh, God, Mary Beth, no way are you going to find a place there. First of all, they're outrageously expensive. And two, they're hardly ever come up for rent and blah, blah. And you know what? Like every other challenge in my life, I'm like, tell me no, and I'm going to prove to you that I can do it. And I did. And I found this amazing apartment, and then I found roommates. But it's eventually, after doing the teaching English, then, freelance translator, freelance interpreter, I was like, okay, I'm kind of bored. I've kind of, lived out what I think, is enough time here without wasting what I essentially wanted to do in my life. So I made the decision to come back to the U.S., came back to my parents' home in Chicago, applied to the DEA and the Secret Service, and then just probably about a couple months later, because I didn't find anything work-wise in Chicago, I ended up moving to D.C., essentially because both agencies told me that because I had lived overseas and had traveled to so many countries that I should expect to wait about 2 years to be hired,
right.
Which is fascinating because I did move out to D.C. I got a great job. I was this, Central and South American expert, the Latin American expert, along with another woman in an agency called the Center for Democracy, where we did election observation. So I was continuing to use my Spanish, which was awesome. And 10 months later, I was getting offered a job, and I almost dropped the phone. I was in a hotel in Miami coming back from Central America, and I get this, message from our front desk person. Hey, Agent so-and-so called you from the Secret Service. I just figured it was another hurdle I had to go through before, as they were doing my background or whatever. And he's like, hey, Mary Beth, how you doing? And I was like, good. And he starts laughing. He goes, this is, so-and-so. I'm calling to offer you a job with the Secret Service as a special agent. And I was like, holy shit, because I expected to wait at least another year. And, to me, I feel like I can be pretty realistic about why that was. One was I was bilingual, and they have very few. As you read in my book, I was the only Spanish speaker in the Washington field office of the Secret Service.
Let's talk about that Let's talk about that for a second. It seems unusual to me, sure. Especially in sort of post 9/11, where we realized we didn't have enough Arabic speakers to translate the information that was coming in. How is it possible that in a cosmopolitan city like D.C., you're the only Spanish speaker in the Washington field office in the Secret Service? That makes sense.
I hope that that's changed, but the government is notorious for not being commonsensical as far as allocation of resources. I mean, we had plenty of Spanish speakers. We had a ton of them in Miami, which is where I thought I might eventually end up because they have a very cool team task force down there that works a lot with Central and South America. But there was no common sense in saying we need about a half dozen up here minimum. I was whipped around everything from going with senior agents who were coordinating official visits from, say, the president of Spain, so they'd be going to embassies to coordinate the advance and the visit itself, to rates in areas where, let's say, at that time, counterfeit money was primarily being produced by South American countries. So essentially the perks whose houses we were raiding and their colleagues were going to be Spanish-speaking. They need somebody who was Spanish-speaking. I would be pulled into interviews. Random calls that would come into the Washington field office. I'd get like a beep, hey, Wilkas, are you available? We have a call. We have no idea what they're saying. And I'd like, sure, pass it along. And so for me as a new agent to be sought out that much was awesome, and it gave me amazing experience.
Do you think 9/11 was really sort of the wake-up call in terms of our, I know in the intelligence service they certainly have language speakers, and they send them to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey to become bilingual. Yeah. But is there? I mean, just look at Los Angeles Police Department and LA Sheriffs. I mean, they teach Spanish to their recruits in the academy, which that never happened back in the old days when I was around. And so, do you think there's a movement in law enforcement in this country that you say we've got to be better connected to the diversity of the people that we serve or the crooks we talk to?
I would hope so, Steve. I mean, there has to be sometimes something as horrific as 9/11 to give a wake-up call on many levels, and you would hope that would go, oh, God, commonsensically, we need X, Y, and Z. And I know post 9/11 really changed the Secret Service for good and for bad because, probably like a lot of agencies and probably like law enforcement, things became really hairy, very hectic. People were working even more hours than usual. And listen, as you know, just like in most law enforcement, divorces are high enough. That didn't help.
Alcoholism.
So you would hope that there's some common sense that people go, okay, what can we do to mitigate that, right?
Yeah. So you talk about
but I can't say for sure.
Yeah, you talk about 9/11. That was probably a sea change for you. You ended up working for the Department of State and Diplomatic Security and teaching kind of probably a put together academy out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, for these folks that are going to different foreign countries. Talk about that process.
Yeah, so I had, after Haiti, so when your readers grab my book and they get through the Haiti chapter, they'll read that I got pretty burnt out and kind of made the decision. It's like, okay, I've been out of undergrad for 10 years. It's just really time for me to get back and do graduate. I always knew I would get a graduate degree. I didn't know in what. And at the time, I was like, okay, I decided I'm going to do forensic psychology. And I came back. It took me a while to get into the program because I didn't undergrad. My major was not psychology, so I needed a couple of more classes. So I did that. I worked another job. And then, I finished in the year at the end of 99. And 9/11 happened shortly after, and I made an attempt to volunteer psychology services to New York, which is where I got my master's in forensic psychology. And every agency I called was like, oh, thank you so much, but we really have abundance of volunteers. So they would hand me the name of another agency to call. And ironically, a few months prior, before 9/11 ever happened, which I just think is a little bit bizarre, I had received a call from a former colleague that I had worked with in Haiti, and he said, listen, we're starting up an academy for the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program, which is a U.S. State Department program. And this is a program, by the way, Steve, that's existed since 1983 when the U.S. Marine barracks were bombed in Lebanon.
Right.
And this was just an extension, meaning they were expanding it out of D.C., bringing in more programs. So my program was the VIP protection program. There were other programs. There was like investigations, terrorist this. There were all different programs they were opening up in this academy. But I was like, okay, well, I guess they don't want me to serve this way through my psychology resources. I guess it's supposed to be through kind of getting back into my old field as a trainer. So I was one of 5 people that was brought into the program, the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program, to teach in the VIP protection program. And what we did was, as we say, we taught quote-unquote friendly foreign nationals who were vetted by the U.S. government to come here to this country and get 3 weeks of training, which was like sort of like a mini course of what I might have done down at Glencoe in Georgia. You were talking about earlier, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Sort of like the art of executive protection, the art of, protecting your number ones. And that could have been, a president, a king, a prime minister, whatever the number one in their country was. They came here in groups of between 18 and 24. And they were here for 3 weeks, and they did everything from walking formations and motorcade operations to shooting to defensive tactics to anti-terrorism driving.
And during that time span, that's a lot of that happened within the shadow of 9/11. Did you feel sort of the urgency of the mission at that point? You always feel the urgency of the mission, but did you have the same sort of feel that everybody else felt, that like the world had changed and the urgency of the mission was really what it was about?
Incredibly so. I wouldn't have been able to articulate it like you, but 100%. It was every day of every training group that I was protecting. The first one came from Bangladesh, the second from Kazakhstan. Those were the first 2 we did in 2001. Were so impactful for me, particularly the Bangladesh one, because it was so close to where many of the people that were responsible from 9/11 came from. And so it was again, just a fascinating mission that I accepted to do. I did that for a year and a half. And it didn't die in that year and a half, that urgency, that knowing that, like, we have to keep training these people, and we've got to keep training our own people to defend this country.
Right.
And as you know, by 03, or 02 maybe even, but I can't remember, maybe you remember, is when they started sending in, the contractors more,
right.
Because we didn't have enough military
Blackwater guys
to go into Iraq and Afghanistan. So, that was, and I continued what I considered my patriotic duty after a year and a half there into my mission in Colombia.
So when you talk about the transition to Colombia, there's a group there, FARC, F-A-R-C, and that stands for?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What are those?
It stands for Fuerzas Armadas, radical, gosh, you're catching me off guard.
Comunistas or something?
Colombian Revolutionary Armed Forces. Yeah.
So they're sort of they were the primary
Mm-hmm.
terrorist group in Colombia, and the one that was sort of more active with engaging with the military in Colombia and engaging with the government in a terroristic way.
Absolutely.
And so your mission in Colombia was to guard not only the work out of the U.S. Embassy, but to guard your protectees in Colombia were the Colombian leadership in the government.
Yeah. So I received a call from the embassy offering me a job to be the U.S. security advisor to the Minister of Defense of Colombia. Now, at the time, the Minister of Defense of Colombia was a female, and she was extremely vocal about her determination to stop corruption in the Colombian military, which you can imagine would turn into a shit show for her.
I got to remind you not to curse. That's my fault. Sorry.
Well, oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry.
And so those guys, they were trying to destabilize the government, and you're protecting a woman who has a position as a female in a Latin American country. How was she perceived in that role as being a woman?
She feared the very generals that were supposed to be her supporters. And this was the interesting thing. So at the time, our U.S. ambassador was a female, Ann Patterson. Marta Lucia Ramirez was the Minister of Defense, and so they made the decision that they wanted to hire a female because Marta Lucia Ramirez, the Minister of Defense of Colombia, felt so much threat from the very men that she was working with, the men that were protecting her, the men that were, it was like surrounded by people she couldn't trust, that they put out this was where sort of the name Unicorn started, was the head of security for the embassy comes into a Monday morning meeting that they have, a debrief, and he comes in and he goes, okay, you guys, I know, I'm looking for a unicorn, but does anybody know a female who's a former State Department agent or a former Secret Service agent who just happens to be bilingual in Spanish and wants to come to Colombia? Like, he was joking, like, no way are we going to find this person. And one of my former colleagues was eating his breakfast, and he had the stuffed mouth, and he's like, like, I know one. And long story short, in about 3 months' time, I was on a plane over to Bogota, Colombia. And,
you were their needle in the haystack.
Yeah, it was very bizarre. And the really nice thing for me is, although quite a chauvinistic country as well, when I was a trainer in the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program in Albuquerque, I had trained 3 groups of Colombians. So I already knew many people over there. So it wasn't like they're looking at me like, oh, yeah, as if this female, like as if I'm going to listen to her.
And
when
also,
I got there, it was like, what?
Yeah, and also you're no babe in the woods in terms of the culture of Spain and Peru and other places that you've been. So obviously Colombia is different than other. Not every Latin American country is the same, or Spanish country. But the idea that you had some sense of the culture when you got there.
100%.
I got 5 minutes left with you. I wanted to hear from what you're doing now and how you kind of got to the George Washington University and what kind of stuff you're teaching, and give us a sense of what you're doing in your post-law enforcement protective life.
Yeah, so after Colombia, which ended up to be 2.5 years, I came back to the States. I met my now husband, and what happened was when he and I merged lives, I was living in San Diego at the time, and he and I merged lives in a town called New Hope, Pennsylvania.
Was he at the SEAL team base in San Diego, in Coronado?
He was actually not a SEAL at the time. He had already started a company. that was a contract, a security company, one of those ones that sent contractors to Afghanistan and Iraq.
Right.
And I think your listeners will laugh at this, but you can, if you were seeing me, you'd see my face crunch up because I was like, I'm moving to a place for a guy. I mean, I had spent my life being super independent. I was at the time 39 or probably 40 years old, had never been married, and I just decided, I was like, you know what, I'm giving up all this. I had become part of a investigative/protection company, and I had, equity in that company, and I had a nice position. I was COO.
That's Vern Abelo's company, yes, in Colorado Springs.
Yeah,
yep.
yeah, Vern. Yeah, you know Vern, right?
I do.
And so when I moved, I gave up everything. I gave up my amazing life in San Diego. I gave up my position. I gave up my equity. And I made this decision to do something for me, and that was my decision to go back to get my doctorate in clinical psychology. And so that was 2008. I finished in 2013. It's a 5-year program. And so with that, we've moved a couple places. And when we moved to the D.C. area a few years ago, it was like, oh, now what am I going to do, right? And I didn't really want to start my own practice because we didn't think we were going to be there very long. So I'm like, let me see, I'll put up my resume to some of the universities. And I did 1 semester at the University of Maryland. And then GW picked me up, and this is going to be my 5th semester with GW.
Great.
So, yeah, not only do I teach abnormal psychology, but they made it happen. I proposed to teach a course that I was creating 100% on my own called The Psychology of Crime and Violence, and they said, okay, and they made it happen within a year's time. So this fall will be the 2nd time I'm teaching it.
So are you back in sort of Zoom world like everybody else, or are you doing live classroom stuff, or are they kind of a hybrid? Or
Unfortunately, 100% Zoom, because my personality. I love to engage with my students, and I'll miss that, but I think it's much rougher on the students. So I'm doing my best to make these Zoom classes as classroom-oriented as possible, right? I'm making all my students have their cameras on. It's mandatory. I said to them, I don't care if you have bedhead, if you're in your PJs or your room's a mess. I'm making it mandatory because I want to see your face. Like, if your guys are going to see me, I don't want you falling asleep. I want you engaged because the topics, Steve, are amazing.
Right. Yeah, I'm kind of doing the same thing. I'm teaching for Alliant University in San Diego this term as well. I'm teaching evidence and interviewing and interrogation class. And
cool.
It's all about, engaging in a way that they feel like, they're paying good money to be there, and it's a different world. But at least, one thing is people are kind of dialed into the Zoom process, so it's not that foreign. So Mary Beth Wilkas Janke's book is called The Protector, A Woman's Journey from the Secret Service to Guarding VIPs and Working in Some of the world's most dangerous places, and that's a no kidding there. The book is available on Amazon as a paperback, a hardback, and also as a Kindle. So she's we've been friends, 25 years, something like that, and I really appreciate your time, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's been a lot of fun.
I'll send you the link for the show, and it was great talking to you. And your life can't be captured in the short time that we talk, so that's why they have to get the book.
It's a start, and thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoy.
Thanks a lot, Mary Beth, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, take care, Steve.
Thanks. So let's test your Crime Time IQ with this week's crime quiz question. I'll be talking about preventing carjackings, and as part of the Crime Time safety tip, we ask if a carjacking is classified as an auto theft or a robbery. It's a good question. Some law enforcement agencies count it differently. Is a carjacking an auto theft or a robbery? Some call it a car theft because the person's car was stolen. Others call it a robbery since it almost always involves using force or a weapon to gain somebody's property. But here's the deal. It's most accurately, if you think about our crime quiz here, an auto theft. Police chiefs categorize it as a robbery sometimes to make it seem like their auto theft stats are down, but it's actually an auto theft. So carjacking is really classified in the crime world and the statistics as an auto theft. This week's Crime Time safety tip, it's all about your car. The crime of carjacking was not that common back in the day before car alarms and engine kill switches and things like that. Consider why. It's fairly easy to steal somebody's car by hot wiring the ignition system. That still happens. People can Slim Jim open the window and jump in and make off with the car. Driving the car away, sometimes the owners have left the keys in the ignition. That's even easier. But today many cars have built-in alarm systems. They have built-in kill switches. They have built-in engine cutoffs and things like that. So a crook would much rather have you start the car and then drive away than try to break the window or pick the lock or Slim Jim it open. As such, their best chance of confronting you is when you least expect it. You're sitting in your garage, or you're sitting in your driveway in the car with the engine running. You're sitting at a traffic light, getting into or getting out of your car at work. You're at school, you're at the store. So that's when the carjackers are most likely to put a gun to your head and demand that you get out of the car. They don't have to defeat any security equipment. So the Crime Time safety tip this week is to protect yourself from a carjacking by always keeping your doors locked when you're in your car. Keep your windows rolled up. Pay attention to who comes up to you when you're walking to your car, or when you're getting inside, you're sitting at a light, or you're parking somewhere. Anybody approaches your car and you feel uncomfortable, lean on your horn and keep leaning on until they run away, or you can drive away safely. You should not let anyone, either alone or as a protest group, as we have seen recently, get close enough to touch your car or try to block it in. Pull away quickly, drive safely away. So thanks for listening to this episode of Crime Time. I encourage you to go to my website at crimetimeradio.com. Send me an email with questions or topics you want me to cover on future shows. You can connect with me on LinkedIn at Dr. Steve Albrecht. You can certainly follow me on Twitter at Dr. Steve Albrecht. That's Albrecht. So it's Dr. Steve Albrecht on Twitter. In our world, there are sheep and shepherds and wolves, and too many people are sheep and too few people are shepherds. There are a lot of wolves out there. There are not enough police officers or sheriff's deputies to protect us all. Therefore, you need to be a shepherd. Take care of yourself, protect your family, your loved ones, your friends, and your coworkers. Pay attention and be prepared to defend yourself with legal force if necessary. Be a good witness for the police if you see a crime. Stay safe and aware and alert at home, at work, at school, and on the road. My thanks again to Dr. Mary Beth Wilkas Janke, her book, The Protector, A Woman's Journey from the Secret Service, to guarding VIPs and working in some of the world's most dangerous places, is available on Amazon as hardback, as paperback, and as a Kindle book. So thanks for listening to Crime Time. My thanks to Jim Whining and producer Matt and all the good folks at Acts Media Group. I'm Steve Albrecht, and thanks for listening to What I Know is Right.